Ladies and gentlemen, NUPI colleagues, and Dr. Erik Herron. First of all, let me express my deep gratitude to NUPI for holding this timely seminar on Ukraine. Since November last year, and in the following 3 months, this country, larger than France in territory, and with, until recently, 46 million people, has gone through a deep crisis and is still in a very, very uncertain transformation. In this time period, the people at Maidan held its leaders vertically accountable for economic hardships, lack of transparency, and meandering foreign policies. And they rallied for 3 consecutive months in what became a gradual spiral of violence, among other things, initiated by draconian law enforcement regulations adopted in January 2014. By spring 2014, Russia had annexed Crimea after a popular referendum held there, which contradicted the law of referendums in Ukraine and the constitution of Ukraine. An armed revolt was erupting in the eastern part of the country at that time. And Ukraine was facing even harder times. Presidential elections in May 2014 brought Poroshenko to the presidency. He initiated, among other things, an armistice in June that was to last for 10 days. But rebels in the east did not lay down their arms, and the conflict is still ongoing. This short list of grievances form the backdrop for today's talk. We are so fortunate to have one of the US's foremost experts on Ukrainian politics in Oslo, Dr. Erik Herron. He was invited by the University of Oslo to come here for 1 week, and we are extremely pleased that you're giving us this talk today, Erik. Dr. Herron started out, as most of us, by studying the Russian language. At the time, it was the lingua sovieticus. After an interval of studying, among other things, Uzbek languages, Herron has moved deeper into the study of post-Soviet elections and politics, and is now widely publishing on Ukrainian electoral dynamics. Why is this important? Well, because by the end of October, Ukraine is holding parliamentary elections. Norway is sending a substantial amount of OSCE election observers to Ukraine for the forthcoming elections in a couple of weeks. And that makes us even more fortunate, I think, to have you here, Erik, to speak to us on myths, misdirections, and misconceptions in the Ukraine conflict. So welcome, wish you welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. And thank you all for coming today. So 3 questions have motivated my talk today. The first is, what are the origins of the conflict in Ukraine? The second is, why did the conflict turn violent? And the third is, what can we expect in the coming weeks and months in Ukraine? And I'm trying to capture these questions under 3 topic areas: the myths, the misconceptions, and the misdirections in this conflict. First, we'll talk about myths. Myths are often origin stories that are repeated, that may have a basis in fact, but don't fully reflect what is empirically verifiable on the ground. And one of the dangerous myths, I think, that has been perpetuated in the Ukrainian conflict over the past few months is that it has a fairly simple origin. So when the media and pundits were looking to explain the conflict to a public, an international public that became interested in Ukraine, perhaps for the first time, they looked at maps. This is a map that was published in the Washington Post in January, so prior to the ouster of President Yanukovych, as protests were spreading across Ukraine. And this map was in a post on the Washington Post entitled "The One Map You Need to Understand the Ukrainian Conflict." And you see the regions of Ukraine, the south and the east, by predominant language use, Russian, the center and the west by predominant language use, Ukrainian, and where the protests are. In addition, the author showed this map, the results of the 2010 presidential election. And overlaying these, he makes the suggestion that language, ethnicity, vote choice, and conflict not only coincide but are causal. And they do indeed seem to coincide. They seem to coincide. But I will suggest to you that this is a map and a conclusion that you should be skeptical of. If I showed you this map, this is a map of the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War. The red states are in the Confederacy, the blue states are in the Union, the yellow states held slaves but were essentially in between. They sided with the Union or the Confederacy depending on the state. And then I showed you this map, the Electoral College vote in 2012. There's a fair degree of coincidence between these two maps. I could say to you, this is the one map you really need to understand contemporary American politics. And you would all look at me skeptically, and you should look at me skeptically. Now, what is similar between these maps, or among these maps? Well, in the US context, if you go to the South and you ask people about the Civil War, they may tell you it's not really the Civil War. It's the war between the states, the war of northern aggression. They have different heroes, they have different villains, they have different interpretations of the past. And these may coincide with some vote choice. But the other thing to be clear about and skeptical about is we are looking at information aggregated, collected at the state level in the United States and at a similar level in Ukraine. So what about language use in Ukraine? The first thing to understand is that most Ukrainians are bilingual. If they don't speak the other language, Ukrainian or Russian, they understand it. Many Ukrainians speak a hybrid language, Surzhyk, so a hybrid of Russian and Ukrainian. So if we were to take this map, and instead of looking at it at the regional level, if we were to look at predominant language usage at the regional level, at a lower level of aggregation, say the municipal level, and if we were to include Surzhyk, this map would look quite different. So one issue is that the interpretation of language, especially when you look at it at the regional level, presents a misleading picture of how Ukraine might be divided. Ukraine is divided in many ways, and I'll get to that in a moment. So language is not as simple a division as it's purported to be. The other piece of this is that language is often considered to be, implicitly or explicitly, coincidental with ethnicity. That is, if you're a Russian speaker, you must be Russian. If you're a Ukrainian speaker, you must be ethnically Ukrainian. That's not necessarily the case. Moreover, it does not, while it can coincide with worldview, it does not determine worldview. And I think this is where the division is most acute and most important and most critical for us to understand this conflict. So in April, in the middle of the conflict, in April, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems had a nationwide survey. And in this survey, they asked questions about values that are shared with the West, values that are shared with Russia. You'll note these don't sum to 100%. You could identify more than one item. But these are the top 5 responses for values shared with the West and for values shared with Russia. Values shared with the West are prospective, forward-looking. They are about governance. They are about aspirations, rights and freedoms, democracy, rule of law, respect for people, economic development. Those who believe that they share values with Europe and with the West are looking to improve the way Ukraine is governed. Those who responded to the value shared with Russia question, you can see, have a different perspective. It is retrospective. It is backward-looking. It is about shared traditions, heritage, history, culture, ethnic heritage, morality, language. And the division and the challenge then becomes, how do you convince communities who share these values or who privilege these values that how do people who share the values with the West or privilege these values, how do they convince those who believe that their history, traditions, culture, ethnic heritage, religion, morality, and language are paramount? How do they convince them that Europe provides that linkage? It's very difficult. They really can't do that. The linkage is with Russia. In the same way, how do those who believe that their cultural connections with Russia are so critical, how do they convince those who aspire to these European values that a Russian trajectory or direction will provide those? Well, they can't right now. The Russian governance model doesn't provide those kinds of outcomes. So the divisions are about worldview. If you know what language someone speaks, it might provide a clue as to what values they share with Russia or values they share with the West, but it is not determinative. I have a colleague, and this is an anecdote. An anecdote should not be confused with data, and many anecdotes should not be confused with data, but I'm going to tell you just a brief anecdote that I think illustrates this point. I have a colleague many years ago at Kiev-Taras Shevchenko University, Faculty of Law, ethnic Russian, speaks Ukrainian in the classroom, but his predominant native language is Russian. And he said to me, you know, when I go to Russia, I feel like I'm in a foreign country. When Russia plays Ukraine in football, I root for Ukraine. I'm a citizen of Ukraine. I speak Russian, and I'm ethnically Russian. But my values are Ukrainian, and my values are Western. And I suspect that he is not alone. So knowing language and knowing ethnicity does not necessarily tell you where values and perceptions lie. But it is this division that propels much of the conflict. So moving to a misconception. Russia is the only villain. In this story, Russia is a villain. Russia is perceived by many Ukrainians to be a villain that has been responsible for many tragedies in Ukraine's history. The famine in the 1930s. Some attribute the Chernobyl disaster to mismanagement by the Soviet Union, but attribute it to Russian mismanagement as well. So there's a deep, sometimes, a deep antipathy toward what Russian rule is perceived to have done to Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. But in this conflict, there are many villains. And there are some major villains and minor villains. When I say a villain, what I'm talking about are individuals or actors who are at least in part culpable for the environment that has led to conflict. And the major villains here are twofold: the Yanukovych administration and the Russian political elite. The violent turn of this conflict, especially at the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014, continuing to today, the violent turn first occurs with the use of repressive force by the Yanukovych administration. Now, in 2004, many of the same ingredients were present. Viktor Yushchenko was victimized by fraud in the second round of the presidential election. Ukrainian citizens mobilized, took the streets peacefully, occupied the streets and protested. A negotiated settlement led to a new round, a third round, really a repeat of the second round, and Viktor Yushchenko was victorious. During this time, there was discussion of separatism. I was on a radio program in the United States, and I was asked, will there be civil war in Ukraine? And I said, no. The conditions are not ripe for civil war. And there was no violence. Think what you will about President Kuchma and his rule in Ukraine. He made the decision not to use repressive force against protesters. And I was present during these protests. I was there as an election observer in 2004 in that second round. I was on Maidan when protesters were there. There were some rumors and some concern about the possibility of violence, but the environment was mostly festive and peaceful, well-regulated, self-regulated. The Yanukovych administration's decision to use violence precipitated a spiral of violence because there were responses by protesters. And this is also where many members of the Ukrainian right are involved in counter violence against the Yanukovych administration, which further escalates what happens on the streets. And it wasn't just the Ukrainian right, but they're prominent players in this. So the Yanukovych administration is a critical villain in sparking the escalation of violence. And as I mentioned, the ingredients were not present in 2004 for civil war, and they weren't present a few months ago. And I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. It is the Russian political elite's decision to intervene that escalates the violence further. Again, I'll come back to that point in more detail. What about minor villains? Minor villains. The Ukrainian political elite has consistently failed to collaborate, cooperate, and work together on policy and governance issues that are critical for Ukraine to move forward. Petty personal disagreements and antipathies have undermined opportunities. The entire post-Orange Revolution period is an example of this. And I think, unfortunately, the upcoming elections may further be an example of failures to cooperate and the potential for greater dysfunction by the Ukrainian political elite. What about the Western political elite? There have been many publications of late, one prominent one in Foreign Affairs recently, which says that, look, the expansion of NATO threatens Russia, and the US and Europe should know better. Now, personally, we can talk about this in Q&A. I am troubled by interpretations of international politics that suggest that Ukrainian people and Ukrainian politicians don't have agency and that we're in a great power era. But this view exists. And in a follow-up to that Foreign Affairs article, there was an interview of the author, John Mearsheimer, and a question came from a Russian press source, which essentially said, you know, this is the view that has been articulated by many Russian politicians. It is, you know, it's nice to hear this, supported by an academic. That is, the notion that there are spheres of influence and that the West has overstepped what it should do. Now, again, we can talk about this. My perspective isn't, I am not supportive of that argument, but it is critical to understand that that perception not only exists in the public, but may be propelling some of the decisions made by the Russian political elite. So to understand the conflict and to understand who is perceived as a villain, the Western political elite has to be included at least in that context. So let me return to the question of the conditions on the ground. So many years ago, I was involved in a survey research project. We asked Russian speakers in the former Soviet states about their identification of homeland. What do they consider to be their homeland? Whether they felt threatened, and whether or not the Russian Federation should defend their interests. And we looked at survey respondents in Ukraine, in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan. And you can see this table from a paper we published many years ago. The response here is for the question, do you think that Russian authorities should defend the interests of Russian speakers? Ukraine and Belarus and Ukraine are statistically indistinguishable. A small percentage of Russian speakers felt that the Russian Federation should defend their interests. This is, again, a survey that focused on Russian speakers. If you ask people what their homeland is, it's a little hard to read, I apologize, but a little over 40% identify Ukraine or a Ukrainian city. This is a nationwide sample, so there's 3% Crimea. The Crimean sample was, subsample was small. 16% identify Russia, 16.4%. 2% identified a Russian region. So in the late 1990s, Russian speakers were identifying Ukraine as their homeland at a far greater rate than they were identifying Russia. An important point also is that 14% indicated the Soviet Union was their homeland. Now you might say, it was a long time ago. Things have changed. Other scholars, Grigor Pop-Eliches and Graham Robertson, conducted a similar survey. This was a nationwide poll, so it didn't focus just on Russian speakers. In January of 2013, they asked the question of homeland. Around 70% or higher of respondents in Ukraine, in 4 regions, the West, the Center, the South, and the East, identified Ukraine as their homeland. You see, Crimea is an outlier on this. The respondents there identified the region as their homeland. What is notable is the difference between responses. Again, the samples are different, so we have to be a little careful of this interpretation. But the difference in responses from the late 1990s to 2013. Russia is a small blip. The Soviet Union, a country that no longer exists and has not existed for many, many years, is the homeland identification, the sort of the second level homeland identification for respondents. So respondents are identifying Ukraine as their homeland. 10 years ago, or more, a little bit more than 10 years ago, there was not an identification of threat. One could imagine that those who felt threatened are also more likely to migrate. So if anything, over time, we might see that value decline. If people identify Ukraine as their homeland, if they're not feeling threatened, if they are, essentially satisfied with the state-based status quo, you don't have conditions ripe for civil war, for people to take up arms to separate from Ukraine, absent some kind of external intervention. And we know that there has been intervention, despite denials. Now, what about the Ukrainian political elite and their culpability as minor villains? I mentioned that there have been issues of cooperation, compromise, policymaking, outcomes that benefit Ukraine and advance Ukraine as a democratic and transparent state. Ukrainian politicians have been corrupt. Transparency International notes that Ukraine is a highly corrupt country. They have been fixated on winning elections and winning them in ways that, while follow the letter of the law, perhaps don't uphold the spirit of democratic competition. So many of you are going to be election observers. How many of you are planning to be election observers? Just show of hands. So many of you. So one critical issue for you to be aware of, if you're not already, is that while there are many parties competing on the ballot, 29 on the party list ballot, more are nominating candidates in the districts. Many of them are not on the ballot or participating in the election to win seats for themselves. Many of them are participating to help someone else win seats. So this is information from the 2012 parliamentary election. I work very closely with a Ukrainian NGO, which is a research organization called CIFRA. They've done some really incredible work related to the upcoming election. I encourage you to take a look at their website, cifragroup.org. I cooperate with the director, Nazar Boyko, on several research projects, including those related to the role of technical parties. So what are technical parties? Technical parties are officially registered parties. They're on the ballot. And as I suggested, their primary purpose is not to win seats for themselves. So there are 225 districts in Ukraine for this upcoming election. Now, some of them are not going to hold elections, an issue we can talk about later. But there are 225 districts, and there are 30,000 or so polling stations. Each district has a commission. Each polling station has a commission. These commissions have agenda-setting power and the power to interpret ballots. That is, if there are ballots that are questionable, they decide what gets counted and what doesn't get counted. Who gets on these polling station commissions? Parties that are registered can get on polling station commissions. If they're running a single candidate in the country, they could, in principle, get on a polling station commission across much of the country. There are more parties registered than there are spaces on polling station commissions. So there are lotteries to determine who gets in polling stations. At the district level, there are lotteries. In 2012, we noted this phenomenon. And an additional phenomenon, which I'll talk about in a moment. But these are the main factions in Parliament. So every registered faction in Parliament, so these are parliamentary parties, they are guaranteed seats on the polling station commissions. The parties on the right, these are small parties. Sometimes they've existed for many years. Some have run for office legitimately. But in this election, we considered them to be technical parties. Why? So to populate the 30,000 polling station commissions, every party has to have a list of people that they would put in these commissions at the initial stage. But they don't win every lottery. So what happens is they trade people. So this is an example from the Party of Regions faction from the 2012 parliamentary election and its affiliated technical parties. The Party of Regions faction received 2,000 members to populate polling station commissions from other political parties. And they gave away 4,000 people to other political parties. How do we know this? We have the registration information for every member of every commission nominated by the parties in the initial stage and the end point. So we can see when someone changed a party affiliation. Sometimes they change a party affiliation, sometimes they change a position, sometimes they change an electoral commission, sometimes they change a combination of these factors. And the dial shows on the outside the total number. And then as you move in, you can see the numbers received and the numbers donated. This is by the Party of Regions faction. It would look similar for the other political parties. You can see all of them except the Communist Party have technical parties associated with them. And in fact, this understates the number of technical parties. We had to set a limit. The number of personnel traded, we set a numerical limit to consider a party a technical party. We could actually have expanded the list. These are the largest contributors to or recipients from the core party of personnel. So you say, well, fine, they're, maybe manipulating these rules. It doesn't violate the rules. Does this matter? So we further looked at and analyzed the results from the 2012 parliamentary election at the polling station level. And we conducted a regression analysis. I won't go into the details unless you have questions, but let me just point out this. This shows under different conditions the expected outcome, in this case for the Party of Regions, in the East. So we controlled for various factors in our analysis, including location, including polling station size, and so on. And we looked especially at the officers. So every commission has a chair, a deputy chair, and a secretary. If the Party of Regions had no officers affiliated with it or its technical parties, we expected to get a little bit over 61% of the vote in the East. If the Party of Regions controlled the chair position and the other two officers were its technical party, got a couple percentage points higher. We replicated this analysis in the presidential election. The results are similar. It is not just the Party of Regions where you find these kinds of outcomes. Now you might say, well, this is a small number. It's just a couple percentage points. You start to aggregate that over the country, it's a lot of votes. You might ask, well, how does this happen? Well, in 2004, I'm in a polling station. This is the presidential election, the second round. It's Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. And there are 35 or 40 ballots that are disputed. They're disputed mostly because a candidate is checked on one, say Viktor Yushchenko. The other candidate's name is crossed off. That technically violates the law. You can only mark the candidate you're for. So the commission had all of these ballots. They were roughly half and half, where candidate was checked, the other one was crossed off. The commission was controlled by affiliates of Viktor Yanukovych through technical parties. You can probably imagine how the votes were counted. Every ballot that had Viktor Yushchenko's name checked and Viktor Yanukovych's name crossed off was invalidated because it violated the law. Every ballot that had the opposite, Viktor Yanukovych's name, Viktor Yushchenko's name crossed off, counted because that's what the voter wanted. And we can see what the voter really wanted. That's one example of how control of commissions can matter. So I gave you a very detailed example of how Ukrainian politicians have contributed to the problem on the ground. This doesn't technically violate the law, but it is not in the spirit of democratic competition. And it is not one side of the debate that is involved in engaging with technical parties. All right. I think the greatest misdirection, this would be a kind of a feint or a diversion, is that there actually is a grand strategy. I have to admit that as someone who has looked at Ukraine for many years, I have been surprised by the course of events over the last few months. I would not have predicted the invasion and annexation of Crimea, in part because, from my perspective, the end game for Russia was a Ukraine that is not viable for cooperation with Europe, that is dependent on Russia, and that has a chaotic and unpredictable democratic system where Russia can point to Ukraine and say to its citizens, is this the democracy you want? So a chaotic, unstable, dependent Ukraine is a good outcome. At least that was my thought. And I was wrong, that there was more. There was more to this. Misdirections have been a part of the game plan, if there is a plan, but part of the game plan from the get-go. So some of them may be to shore up domestic support, that is within Russia. Calling the ouster of President Yanukovych a coup, emphasizing that he was democratically elected, this plays well to a Russian public. Calling the Ukrainian government fascist does as well, and reminds people of the Great Patriotic War and everything associated with the Great Patriotic War. Emphasizing the legitimacy of the referendum in Crimea and its annexation, as well as the people's republics that have been set up in the East through the infusion of leadership from Russia, and again, emphasizes the legitimacy from a Russian perspective of the actions that have been taken. But denials are also a part of the game plan. So there hasn't been official recognition of the involvement of military and security services except when they're on vacation or lost. And it's reached a really quite absurd level of denial. But indeed, that's where we are. The idea that sanctions are a minor annoyance is also really a denial of what appears to be going on in the Russian economy. And there have been efforts, especially at critical points, to change the narrative on the ground. The unexpected downing of the Malaysian airlines, there were claims from Russia and the Russian media, was downed by the Ukrainian military, or if not downed by the Ukrainian military, it's Ukraine's fault anyway. More recently, the narrative has been altered to suggest that Russian speakers are persecuted and endangered, and that there is this concept of Novorossiya that is a meaningful one. Ralph Clem, a political geographer in the US, has an excellent piece in the Washington Post debunking the Novorossiya mythology. And I urge you to take a look at that if you're interested. Now, these misdirections have been, again, part and parcel of the strategy and the tactics. And to some degree, they've been successful, at least domestically. So this is a Levada Center poll of Russian citizens. The percent that indicate the country's moving in the right direction, these are results from September of every year from 1999 on. And you can see that 40 to 50%, maybe slightly below that, is where the population tends to be. And there are spikes after the invasion of Georgia and after the invasion of Ukraine. And we can expect this popularity, this satisfaction, likely will come crashing down once again to its sort of normal range. In part facilitated by outcomes like this. This is the course of the ruble versus the US dollar as of last week. And you'll note that this is the lowest point in the financial crisis, and it dipped well below the lowest point in the financial crisis. So let me just summarize and finish my remarks by suggesting that I'm not sure what the end game is, but at least in the short term, what is critical for everyone in this room to know and for us to understand about the conflict is that this is an occasional interest for Europe and the United States. There are many events in the world that are considered to be more important to foreign policy makers in the United States and in the European Union. And Ukraine only has a moment. And we may be moving soon beyond that moment. Russia and Russian foreign policy makers will always be interested in what happens in Ukraine. and that this affects the course of events in the coming weeks and months. There is a long game that Russian political elites can play that European and US political elites are unlikely to be interested in playing. So I do expect Ukraine will be a divided country. Those divisions I mentioned earlier, based on worldview, where the conditions were not ripe for civil war, the events of the last 6 months may have changed that equation. The anti-terrorist operation, even though the Ukrainian government has indicated that it is going to avoid civilian targets, it has not avoided civilian targets. Whether intentionally or accidentally, it does not matter. Because that will fundamentally affect the attitudes and behaviors of citizens in the East. And that antipathy that they might have felt toward the government, and there indeed was antipathy. I'm not going to suggest that individuals in the East, while they may not have felt threatened, they didn't like the Turchinov interim government. That the depth of destruction, dislocation, despair in the East is going to make reconstruction, post-conflict reconciliation very difficult for a long time. So the antipathy toward government will intensify, but the ability of the government to make policy, to bring back the East into the fold, has been greatly damaged by what has occurred over the last few months. And I suspect that the accommodations for the East, and there have to be accommodations for the East, but the accommodations for the East will make pro-European Ukrainians unhappy. And so you will have people unhappy everywhere. And that is not a recipe for success. And there will still be villains. Ukraine's economy is reliant on Russia. Its primary trade partner has been Russia. It's, as we know, reliant on Russian natural resources like gas. Relations have to improve for Ukraine's economy to improve. Russia's economy is in trouble. Ukraine's economy is in more trouble. This gas conflict that we have seen erupt between Russia and Ukraine in the past, it may expand. It may expand to include Europe this winter. Directly or indirectly, gas flows may be gas flows might be reduced. The elections that are upcoming are not likely to bring a functional parliament, and that's unfortunate. But I'm pessimistic. We already know that many districts are not going to be able to hold elections. Ukraine has a mixed electoral system. Half of parliament is elected in local constituencies, half on the party list. In those local constituencies, many regions will just not have representatives. There will be technical parties, as I have mentioned. There will be accusations of fraud, and in fact, there are conditions on the ground, especially in the single-member districts, for there to be fraud and allegations already of vote buying and efforts to undermine democratic elections. So, in addition to the elections themselves being a problem, the post-election management of parliament is going to be difficult. We know majority party. It's unlikely there'll be a majority party. It'll be some kind of coalition. And this coalition will be difficult to hold together. So I'm sorry to end on a pessimistic note, but that's where we are. Before I conclude and we move to questions, I just want to thank Nupi for hosting me, for all of you for being here, and to Professor Flikke and the University of Oslo for inviting me to Norway for this visit. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Erik. I think we're going to take our seats behind this panel. And Dr. Jakub Godzimirski will comment this lecture in a short comment, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers after that. So be patient, there will be room for you. Let me see. I could always let you have mine, but you have your own, right?
Thank you, thank you. First of all, thanks to Erik for coming to Oslo and sharing his deep insights and knowledge with us on Ukraine. Ukraine is indeed a very important country. When Gary introduced Erik, he mentioned two dimensions, the territorial and the demographic dimension. I think it's time for us to start thinking about Ukraine as an agent and not as a passive object of international politics. And I will give you some comments to Erik's presentation and share also some of my understanding of the Ukrainian crisis. When it comes to comments, I think that you presented the stuff in a very interesting manner, a more detailed and nuanced picture than the one we meet in media and the one we meet quite often when we discuss those issues with our more knowledgeable colleagues. I liked very much your discussion about the language issue. We see that language is not necessarily something that defines where you are in political terms. I quite often used to refer to the case of Ireland. In Ireland, most of the people speak English, but they feel Irish. So this is also a very good example. When it comes to the Putin's strategy, I think that you are not the only one to be surprised by what he decided to do. My take on this is that had he decided to wait for some time, that he would get Ukraine back, because we know that the new government is forced to conduct a number of economic reforms that are going also to have some deep and grave social consequences. Those consequences are going to be translated into political decisions of the Ukrainian voters, but Putin's strategy has been summed up by some as winning the Crimea and losing Ukraine. Was it what he wanted to achieve? This is an open question. I think that in order for us to understand the complexity of the Ukraine, we have to ask three questions. What this conflict is all about, when the conflict in fact started, and how we can interpret and read this conflict. When it comes to what the conflict can be interpreted as a kind of internal Ukrainian conflict. This is at least the official position of Russia. Russia has nothing to do with the conflict, is not a party to the conflict, and has no influence on what is happening in Ukraine. But we know very well that this conflict has also this bilateral dimension, but this conflict has also much broader ramifications. This is a conflict about Russia with the West. This is about Russia choosing its path into the future. So this conflict, the most intense and dramatic phase of the conflict we see in 2014, but this conflict goes in fact back to 1991, to the question of what Russia should become after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is a part of a broader discussion in Russia on the way for Russia towards the future. Should Russia build a kind of system based on local values and norms, or should Russia join the West and become a kind of well-functioning democracy with well-functioning market economy? So this is this dimension. And then we can read this conflict in many different manners. You have mentioned John Mearsheimer and his purely realistic reading of the conflict. I think there are some dimensions of the conflict, but this does not explain the intensity and the complexity of the conflict at all. You mentioned among your villains Western elites. I think this conflict could also be interpreted as a mismanagement of the institutional dimension of the cooperation. I think that had Russia, Ukraine, and the European Union had discussions prior to the manifestation on Maidan, then the conflict could have turned less violent. And then this conflict is definitely a conflict about norms and values. I think that we see maybe not what Huntington would refer to as a conflict of, as a clash of civilizations, but there is this very clear dimension. And when you were talking about the norms that dominate the Ukrainian society, we see that this normative, value-based conflict is one of the driving forces. I think also that I would challenge you on this issue of whether the US and Europe is permanently interested in Ukraine. I think that in terms, at least in Europe, the conflict has already resulted in a very distinctive shift of the political mood. I happened to be in Berlin 4 weeks ago, having the opportunity to discuss the conflict in Ukraine and the gas dimension of the conflict with the German policymakers and German expert community. And I see a very deep shift in the German approach to the conflict. And I think this may be very crucial for the future interests of Europe in this conflict. We have to do not only with the grave violation of the international law on the part of Russia. Russia has made a decision that is going to have long-term consequences by incorporating or annexing Crimea. Russia has changed the game of the political game in Europe, and this is not something that is going to disappear. We will probably see a sort of settlement of the conflict in the eastern Ukraine, but it's very unrealistic to expect Putin to give Crimea back to Ukraine at least until the end of his presidency in 2024. And this is going to be a point on the political map of Europe that is going to sour relations between the European Union and Russia for many, many years to come. So I don't think that Europe is going to become less interested in finding a working solution to the conflict. There is not only the issue of values and norms at play, it's also about European interests. We can imagine how the situation, the deteriorating situation in Ukraine could develop, and I'm thinking about the economic collapse in Ukraine, but I'm thinking also about the wave of forced migration from Ukraine, and this forced migration would probably reach the neighboring countries like Poland, but also we can expect many Ukrainians moving to Germany and other places in Eastern Europe, in the European Union. So this is not only the issue of norms, but this is also the issue of self-interest, that the conflict in Ukraine should be addressed and should not disappear from the European radar screen. So I think that I will stop here and open for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Jakob, for that comment. Before we open the floor, I would like to ask whether you have some comments to the comments, Erik.
Thank you for the comments. My only comment is I hope you are right that Europe and the United States recognize longer-term interests in Ukraine. I fear that if there is a kind of face-saving alternative for the United States, Europe, and Russia, that would include de facto, not official, but de facto recognition of the annexation of Crimea, some kind of status quo frozen conflict in the east, akin to Transnistria, South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and so on. I fear that the desire to move to other pressing issues could encourage policymakers in Europe and the United States to accept a suboptimal outcome for Ukraine and move on. But I hope you're right. I fear that, after 2004, resources, I know from the educational side, resources that had gone to Ukraine to encourage transparency, openness, democracy, moved on to other places in the world with the implicit, if not explicit, explanation that the battle's won in Ukraine. We got to move to other places. And it was not.
Thank you so much. This means that by all means we are still in this limbo when it comes to Ukraine. And there are elections coming up, as you rightly told us that these are important elections, but you are what the Russians would call an informed optimist, right? Yes. I think we should open the floor, and I think that people should just grab the microphone if Liv is around to give it to you. And there's another person there that has a microphone, whose name I don't know, but he looks nice. State your name and your question as short as possible so that we get ample time for discussions. Please raise your hand, and yeah, there's one here, please.
Okay. Thank you all. Very powerful introductory remarks and very valuable comments from the commentator. I have one question. Looking at the present situation from, let's say, the Russian perspective, it should, in very many ways, give, I think, I should make this a question, but just a few initial remarks. It should really make the Russians a little bit nervous. The Ukrainian adventure has caused them no glory, no pride in Europe, nor in Eastern Europe, nor in Western Europe. The economy is dysfunctional. How can Putin possibly expect to finance the army reform? Currency reforms, currency reserves are going down, and the economy doesn't grow. So, looking at it from this cold perspective and leaving aside the question of shoring up the domestic support and the importance of having a foreign enemy, isn't now perhaps the time come for the Russians to take a long, cold look and say, we got the Crimea, we won't give it back. We got parts of Eastern Ukraine, we can always end up with federation with respect for the Russian minorities in the Eastern Ukraine. So is it now the time to come and say, to change the cards a little bit and do a mini Gorbachev, like Gorbachev did when he came into power? Because the main argument deployed by Russian diplomats, I can remember that from my own time, was we are now going to do a thing to you which will hurt your interest very much. We are going to deprive your favorite picture of Russia as the bully boy on the block, which all become very nice. And that was a very powerful argument, and the Russians came a long way with it. How do you view the prospects of possibly the Russians and Putin doing a mini Gorbachev, not a big Gorbachev because he gave away too much, but a mini Gorbachev?
You respond immediately to we do single questions first, and then we group them at the end. Okay.
Thank you for the question. I think that one critical point that we don't know are the motivations behind the policy choices that Russia is making. If the policy choices are being made to shore up domestic support, then your approach to a kind of a face-saving measure to reduce the commitment in Ukraine, reduce the violence, and then return to internal issues, that may be an option if it is about domestic politics. And there is an interpretation that suggests that it's about domestic politics. There have been concerns raised that it's more than about domestic politics, that in fact there may be a kind of ideological shift. The discussions from the Russian side about Russian speakers in the near abroad, concerns about Russian speakers in the near abroad, could, if that is what is propelling and motivating this conflict, extend it beyond Ukraine. And there are, nervous people in the Baltics and in Kazakhstan who are studying the situation quite carefully. And the problem is we don't really know, and there are other alternatives as well. But if it is about domestic politics, then that alternative, I think, is a possibility. And I wish I knew the answer. I would say months ago, I would have suspected that would be the outcome we would be moving toward. And frankly, I don't know, given the inconsistency in decisions that seem to be coming out of Moscow. It's difficult for me to say what's propelling the.
Okay.
Yeah.
Short comment, please.
I think that you have raised a very important issue, and also the part of the answer Erik has given raises a very important issue, because what we have to do in Russia is that we don't know who, or we know who takes the decisions. It's a very narrow group around Putin, and we don't see any institutional well-functioning system of checks and balances that could check for misunderstanding and misperceptions. And this is really something that we have problems with understanding how decisions are made, who takes decisions on what kind of grounds decisions are made, and the fact that there is no an alternative to this power vertical, that this creates a lot of uncertainty.
Well, thank you. There is one check and balance, though, and that's the economy, right? That certainly keeps checks and balances on the Russian elite. And I saw in Vedomosti that the amount of foreign investments in the Russian economy in the third quarter this year has gone down 10 times. So the impact is coming. Yes, over there, please.
Yes, hello, my name is Hilda Haug, and I work for the OSCE monitoring mission, special monitoring mission. So I spent quite a bit of time in the East the last months, and I just wanted to bring up, you brought up a point about the anticipate against the Kiev, and I would maybe think that from what we saw, it was a slightly more complex picture, where you could also see that, that the way in which of these militias, how they have been behaving, also has actually created a lot of empathy against them, among a lot of the population, especially in Donetsk city and in the bigger places, because they also did not exactly treat their inhabitants very well. And we could see even from, especially after the referendum, how the mood also changed in a lot of the population there. So I think you're right that to some extent that obviously there has been a lot of especially on the TV, a lot of the information that they've gained is saying that it's the Ukrainians who have been doing this and the Ukrainians have been doing that. And to some extent, we've also seen that there have been incidents where they have been hitting civilian population. But I think that there's a bit more of a mix. I think you're really right in saying that it's important for Kiev to stretch out a hand now. I think it really makes a big difference what they do now. But and I'm also cautiously pessimistic about it. But I think that you could see also. I've seen like certain younger people who have also taken a very, very clear stance, who maybe did not have this before. Who said, I had to make a choice, and who decided on what is their state and what is their country, and also I think this issue that you mentioned about the language, where speaking Russian does not mean that you feel that you are belonging to the Russian state. And I think that's also something, actually I never met one person in those 5 months who ever said that they wanted to become a part of Russia, but even though they've identified like culturally. But, yeah.
Comment to this, Erik?
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I thank you for your sort of firsthand account of what's happening in the East as well. I have no doubt that the picture is more complex, and I think what I would like to emphasize is that in this post-conflict reconciliation era that will hopefully come upon us sooner rather than later, while I am not surprised to hear that citizens of the East have not allied themselves with the separatists, that they have not allied themselves with a notion of irredentism or joining with Russia, I fear that when infrastructure needs to be rebuilt, when services need to be restored, when schools need to be repopulated and teachers need to be brought back, and hospitals and so on, when there are delays and challenges, that the antipathy toward the government will grow and the blame attribution will quickly shift to the government. That even though there's recognition that the separatists, and I might put those in quotation marks, the separatists are to blame for much of the destruction, there is collateral damage that is also the responsibility of the Ukrainian security services. But ultimately, when you're in that reconciliation and reconstruction phase, I suspect and am concerned that it will be that blame and anger and hostility will be directed inwardly rather than outwardly, and that will make the process more challenging. But again, hopefully we move to that stage sooner rather than later, because that would be a better place to be.
May I make a brief comment as well? May I?
You may.
Okay. I think that it's also very important to understand that the way media cover this issue is quite often problematic. For instance, 2 days ago, the UN Commission released its report on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, and the overall comment in media is that although the ceasefire was agreed on the 5th of September, there were 10 people dying on average after this date. This is not true, because the report covers the period between middle of August and middle of September, a period with the most intense phase of the armed clashes. So the comment is not very proper, because it really does not reflect the situation between the 5th of September and the 8th of October, but the description covers the period of the most intense and heavy fighting. So we should be also aware of the fact that media may misinterpret the situation as well.
That's why we have people on the ground. Mark, please.
Thank you very much, Mark Lantain, NUPI. One other actor in this process, and we can debate whether they fall into the hero or villain or bystander column, would be NATO. As with Georgia a few years ago, the potential carrot of NATO membership for Ukraine was seen, at least by some analysts, as a major galvanizing effect for Russian activities which came after. Do you see that as the case, or do you see that as pretty much a sideshow to the other issues?
NATO is still perceived as a foe by the Russian political elite. It's also not as widely supported by the Ukrainian population if you look at public opinion surveys, as is integration with the European Union. So the economic aspect, the population movement aspect of integration with Europe is more popular than NATO. And again, this is sort of pre-conflict public opinion surveys. And in some parts of Ukraine, there was outright hostility toward NATO, as we know. I was in Crimea in 2006 during some of the for an event that did not coincide, or that was not sponsored by NATO, but coincided with NATO operations in Crimea, a sea breeze exercise. And NATO expansion was perceived again as a threat, and that again is supported, I think, by public opinion surveys, supported by the reactions and interpretations of the Russian elite. And I'm not sure NATO expansion is as helpful to Ukraine as many would like to think. I mean, the reality is that there are concerns about the defense of NATO members in the Baltics and what might happen if there were incursions in the Baltics. And that's a more defensible position than what you have in Ukraine. So I'm not sure that the extension of NATO is particularly helpful to Ukraine. It is threatening to the other side. Once again, I think that the key for not just improving conditions in Ukraine, but addressing disputes within the Ukrainian population is that if you start asking questions about the ability to move freely in Europe, the ability to do trade, and so on, you find much wider agreement that these are good things. So I think that efforts to expand cooperation, again, economic cooperation in particular, resonate quite well with the Ukrainian public, much more so than NATO. I don't know if that fully addresses your question, but...
Turbo, please.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Tor Buchwald. I do Ukraine here in Norway. First, I'd also like to thank you for the. I can put it like that, right? Do you? Yeah.
Yeah, you're entitled.
I've heard at a podcast they say it like that, so I think it's correct. First, thank you for the talk. Great. I tried to find things to disagree with. That was difficult. I think it was a good talk. There's one small comment and then a question. The small comment is that when we talk about, now we tend to talk about East, and sometimes it gets a bit confusing here because the conflict is only in Donbass. So we need to make that distinction between Donbass and the rest, actually East and South. We're talking about 8 different oblasts, and conflicts only in 2 of them. So sometimes that gets confused. The question is, Ukrainian politicians now go around say that they are grateful to Putin for uniting the country. And when I first heard that, I was kind of skeptical because I think, well, that might happen, but it's far from certain that that will happen. But some recent opinion polls actually do suggest some movement in that direction. For example, the spike in support for independence, which used to be around 60%, now it's spiked to 76, I think, in the last opinion poll. So I was a little bit surprised you didn't touch upon that. So if you could say, don't you think there's any kind of unification of the country in face of Russian aggression, or what do you think about that? Thank you.
So with public opinion, we have to be mindful of short-term and long-term effects. And so just as an example, the slide I showed with the Levada Center poll of the percent of Russians who think the country's going in the right direction is strongly affected by short-term events, or at least it appears that way. The invasion of Georgia, the invasion of Ukraine, we don't know that there will be a kind of regression to the mean, that there will be a dip down in support. I suspect that there will. In the same way, we don't know if the short-term attitude change that we see reflected in public opinion will persist, or if it will dip down. The point, though, the important point is that the vast majority of Ukrainian citizens support Ukrainian sovereignty and independence. Regardless of this uptick, it's still the majority, the vast majority support this. Moreover, if you start, again, asking questions about your identification, what do you identify as your homeland, as I showed? Ukraine is the majority, vast majority, homeland identification for Ukrainian citizens. So I don't have concern, personally, from what I've seen in public opinion data, about the commitment of Ukrainians to their own state and their own sovereignty. In terms of uniting the country, I think the notion is, much like during the Orange Revolution, you had a short-term commitment to ousting corrupt incumbents. And shortly thereafter, divisions, personality differences, policy differences, and parliament became dysfunctional. And I fear that's where we're headed once again. And this election, I think, will be an incredibly important one, not only because of the integrity of the process and its effect on the perceptions of democracy in Ukraine, but also the outcomes. Not only is the Party of Regions not participating, now there are many individuals who are part of the Party of Regions who are participating in the election, in other parties as independents and so on. But it is important for people who are in regions where the Party of Regions has strong support to have an outlet for those policy preferences. And it's unclear, at least on the party list side, that will be fully realized. So Serhiy Tihipko's Strong Ukraine Party is one potential outlet that might pass the barrier, the threshold to get into parliament on the party list. But it's unclear. You are right, and I apologize for sort of using the simplified terms of East and so on. When we start talking about Ukrainian regions, the divisions become very complicated, and you are right that the conflict at the moment is in Donetsk and Luhansk, and that's where it's focused. That is traditionally considered a part of the East, but the East is more, it encompasses other regions as well. So thank you.
Yes, and for background, Tihipko was, as you mentioned yesterday, the second crown prince of Kuchma, besides Yanukovych, actually. So he was the second in command in the Party of Regions, I think maybe, or he was affiliated with, sort of. Okay. Yes, please, here.
Thank you. My name is Trond Botnen. I'm going to be election observer in Ukraine. I have a question about tactics versus strategy. I think most people will probably agree that Putin has employed some rather successful tactics in the Crimea and in the East. The question is sort of, to what extent are we talking about winning battles but losing the war? Or to what extent is there actually a good strategy behind it? If you look at the more, if you look at what is actually achieved, he's effectively removed a lot of pro-Russian voters from the electorate, increasing the chances that more Western-oriented politicians will win. NATO has been reinvigorated. We can expect to see larger defense budgets in Europe. And the Russian economy has been weakened, which are like three strategic areas where the outcome doesn't seem to be so good for Russia so far. I doubt if, obviously, shoring up domestic support has been important, but it's probably not the only concern of Putin. Similarly, protecting the rights of the Russian speakers, to me, sounds very ideological, more like perhaps a pretext than the actual reason for action. So the question goes to both of you from a more, say, long-term realist perspectives. Considering the three areas where Russia has been weakened or its interests have not been furthered so far, what do you think they can achieve? What are the pluses for them that would outweigh these negative developments? And are we going to see a shift, towards more or Russian-Asian cooperation, as we have seen with the China energy deal? And will that be sufficient for them to be able to survive or sustain a break in relations with Western Europe?
I can keep it very brief. Yeah. So I think the primary plus in the column for Russia is the acquisition of Crimea. And it's not because of the tourism or the wine or what have you. It's because of the hydrocarbon resources that it has potential access to now off the shores of the peninsula. That does two things. One is it's a valuable source, a potential source of income to offset some of the losses and costs that will come for the incorporation of Crimea. It also undermines Ukraine's energy independence. So there's oil shale potential resources in the western part of the country to exploit, and also in the eastern part of the country. But keeping Ukraine dependent is an important goal. And acquiring those resources undermines the ability of Ukraine to wrest itself from dependence on Russia. So I think that's the biggest plus in the column.
Jakob?
You have raised the issue of strategy. In 1962, an American historian, Cyril Black, published a chapter in a book on long-term trends in Russian and Soviet foreign policy, and he identified four long-term goals the Russian and the Soviet empires were pursuing. The one was gathering of the Russian lands. The second one was stabilization of Russian borders. The third one was participation in the international system of alliances and institutions. And the fourth one was providing a positive environment for economic reforms in Russia. And I see, if we look at the impact of the Ukrainian crisis, we see that Putin has managed to take control of a territory that could be defined as belonging to Russia in ethnic terms, but on the three other points he has lost rather than won anything. The borders are not have not become more stable. Russia's place in the international system of alliances and institutions has been rather weakened than strengthened, and when it comes to providing a positive environment for economic reform in Russia, this has also suffered.
We could perhaps rephrase Marx and say that there is a ghost going through Russian history, the ghost of the strong state, which is actually the over-empowered state gaining so much power that it actually weakens the possibility for governance. And we're still in this right now. I have three more persons on the list. After the first intervention, the question, I'm going to draw a red line in order for people not to suffocate in this distinguished auditorium. So I will, if you have a question, then please just raise your hand during this intervention. Please, the gentleman over there. Just.
Hello, my name is Andrea Troshenko. I'm Ukrainian, and my question is short and I think one of the most fundamental. How this crisis can influence on international law system and international crime system? Because now we know that Ukraine applied to the international courts about the annexation of Crimea, and there are a lot of different cases which is connected with Interpol, because Ukrainian police and other forces, they opened criminal cases about Russians, and like they open the same cases to Ukrainian. Thank you.
So I have to admit, as a preface to my answer, that I am a great skeptic of international law and the application of international law. I have not found it to be particularly effective. And in this case, while there may be victory for Ukraine within the institutions, the practical implications may not change conditions on the ground. And of course, that's been the great challenge of the international law system in general. So I don't really have much more to say other than I think it's an important question, but the international law system does not function particularly well, and I don't think it will function well for Ukraine in this case.
That's a very short and precise and perhaps also realistic answer. Ms. Irina Sabur, please.
Thank you. Irina Sabur, European Berglund Center, and I'm in charge of projects in Ukraine and Russia in the field of education. I have a just kind of follow-up question to what Tor has said. And that is a question about another myth, which is nationalism, which is extremely rising in Ukraine, a fact or a myth that has been propelled very much recently in the media. The question is whether you see the situation as grave, or how do you assess the situation about that in Ukraine? Because to me, it seems that we can speak about some kind of inclusive identity that is growing in Ukraine. That we see that there are Russian citizens that serve in the Ukrainian army and are in the east, in the Eastern Front. We see a Tatar population that is now living in different regions of Ukraine and mixing, and we see that like slowly but gradually but steady. The Ukrainian government is also taking responsibility for the Tatars. We see different other minorities that we have Jews organizations that are supporting officially all the government of Ukraine, which is indeed a huge step forward in comparison to what was at least 1 year ago. So it seems to me that at least this part can be a bit optimistic about the Ukrainian identity and about Ukrainian patriotism that is becoming more modern than it used to be. And it's I meet also young people from Ukraine who are not willing to even to travel to study abroad because they become aware of having responsibility for their country that might not share the grave expectations of Mr. Gozdemirsky about a huge wave in the future due to the economic crisis. But of course, if it becomes graver, it might be the issue. So some kind of optimistic thoughts from myself, even though the situation is really grave. Thank you for your comment.
So I mentioned that anecdotes are not data, but let me begin with an anecdote. So I was living in Lviv in 2007, and I attended a parade of the Svoboda Party. So the Svoboda Party at the time was the primary nationalist party in Ukraine. And at the beginning of this parade, it was a lovely expression of Ukrainian identity. families, young people dressed in traditional Ukrainian vyshyvanka, marching forward. And as the parade moved forward, and as the parade came to its end, it started to get darker. That is, the images that have been portrayed in the press, especially the Russian media, of symbols that are akin to Nazi or fascist symbols, skinheads, very scary looking people. They're at the back of the parade. And to me, that speaks quite a bit about the Ukrainian national identity and the parties of the right. The fringe right elements are there, but they've traditionally been at the back. These parties have not enjoyed national level successes, with some exceptions. And I think sometimes when they enjoy success, and we'll see the party of Lyashko, how it does in this election. But I suspect that some of its success will be due to not support of extremism, but rather it as a repository of protest votes of citizens who are dissatisfied with what they see as accommodations, special status for parts of the East, for example. Individuals who are dedicated to Ukrainian sovereignty and don't believe that the other parties are as fully supportive of Ukrainian sovereignty as they might see in a Ukrainian nationalist party, and so on. So do the elements exist that have been portrayed as prominent? Well, they exist. That is, again, the reactionary right-wing skinheads, they exist. I have not seen them as powerful. They have not been powerful politically, again, in recent history, and I don't expect them to be powerful in the long term. And there is this issue of memory, historic memory, and historic interpretation. And during that time I spent in Lviv, I talked to a lot of people about their families and their family histories. And they have fond memories of their grandparents fighting in World War II for, in their mind, Ukrainian independence. And they ignore negative aspects that may have been associated with that. And I think, just as one sort of final anecdote, the encounter that my family had in a small village, we went to a festival, we needed a place to stay, our place to stay fell through, we found an elderly couple willing to take us in. After a few shots of vodka, we sealed the deal, and that night talked a lot about Ukraine. And what was fascinating to me is that household was like a microcosm of Ukrainian society. The father had lived in Poland at the time of what was Poland at the time of World War II. And he said, Bandera's men came, killed my parents in front of me. I was 13 years old. He says, I'm Ukrainian, and I didn't think our people would do that to us. And he became kind of a minor Soviet-era bureaucrat and very proud of his experience. His wife, after the Soviet capture of the region and collectivization spread there, her family were branded as kulaks. And they had everything taken from them except the little house where we were staying. And she and her husband lived a happy life together and had diametrically opposed views of what the Soviet state was about. And both of them probably had, some false memories and some real memories of what happened, but they were able to accommodate. And so I think that, to me, that was the ideal for Ukraine, that you won't be able to resolve these historic memories. But the fringe elements that are incredibly threatening, I do think are fringe elements. So I think the Ukrainian national identity that is generally expressed is one that celebrates Ukraine as an independent state. It does ignore some of the darker moments and negative moments, and that's a dangerous thing to do. And so I do worry about that sometimes, but the allegations that you have seen, I have not seen either anecdotally or in any kind of outcomes politically during my time observing the country.
Thank you, Erik. I can only think of one remark to this remark, and that is the fact that you keep telling us that these are anecdotes and not data. But I would say that this is real life world data. So thank you for these insights. And the last question, please.
My name is Sjur Bratland from INSOC. I'm working with the Norwegian oil and gas supply industry, trying to do business in Russia and Ukraine, among other. My question is actually about the sanctions. Will they work? I understand they will hurt both sides, actually. But is this what will bring Putin back to the table, or will it push him even further into the corner? And the second question maybe is, what should we do in the meantime? Because you are talking about weeks and months, but I am thinking actually about years. So
You start on this, Jakob, and then Erik will round off.
I think that we have already seen some effects of the sanctions on Russia. We happen to have a former colleague of ours, Louis Kainer, here at NUPI some weeks ago, and he presented a view from Moscow. He works now for a big international law firm in Moscow, and his impression was that already by the middle of September, the sanctions were very visible in Moscow, especially in milieux that were to work on oil development of oil and petroleum and gas resources in Russia. So I think and I hope that this will somehow have a kind of sobering effect on the Russian political elite, and that they will open for a kind of new phase of this conflict. I will also use this opportunity and say that we need to think not only about the ongoing conflict, but also about the reconciliation and the post-conflict reconstruction, because as we know, all wars end at some stage, and finding a solution to this post-conflict settlement is very important. I think Norway could play a role here with this focus on peace and democracy building. And I would also like to use this opportunity to invite you to another event at NUPI. On the 6th of November, we are going to have a small seminar at NUPI together with our Polish counterpart, where we are going to look at the impact of the Ukrainian crisis on three areas of policy making: security, energy, and migration. So all of you who are interested in Ukraine should come and take part in this event on the 6th of November.
Stay tuned, in other words,
Stay tuned,
please.
yeah.
Yes.
I agree with the statements that were made. Let me just briefly say that much of the political science research on sanctions is quite skeptical about their effects. That is, whether or not they accomplish the full set of goals that they're set out to accomplish. And in this case, I do think that sanctions will bite. Sanctions are hurting. To the extent that they nudge policy, maybe then they are effective. Will they, on their own, alter the course of action that Russia's taken? I don't think so, but they may push Russia to find some kind of face-saving solution more quickly. And again, that's a somewhat skeptical take on sanctions as a complete solution. But I do think that they have, and they will, affect Russian decision-making at some level.
Thank you. I could perhaps also add to this last question that there is a book by Magnus Eriksson, a Swede, on targeted sanctions, which I have studied. And this mixture between the so-called smart sanctions, the targeted sanctions, and the expected short-term effect is somewhat misleading, because targeted sanctions can have long-term effects as well. So this is something to consider. With these words, I would just thank the audience for being with us today and joining us through this very interesting lecture, and also this very interesting discussion. People that have contributed from the floor, thank you to you. Thank you to Jakob for contributing with comments. Thank you to NUPI for hosting us. And most of all, thank you to you, Erik, for coming this long way and sharing your knowledge with us. Please.